microphones. So thanks everybody for joining us here this morning. So you're here for the panel, Paving the Road to Self-Sovereign Identity. So hopefully everyone's in the right space. And I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Adam Gunther, and I lead our blockchain decentralized identity team at IBM. One of the large companies, unlike the last session, that's actually working to help give people control back of their identities. And I actually believe, and I'll let others on the panels kind of speak to why they're here, but I think we have a huge opportunity to really change the world. And it's going to take big companies and small companies alike to make that happen. And that's really why I'm here today. So why don't we go down the row, and I'll let everybody introduce themselves, and why don't you talk about who you are, what's your company role, and really what brought you to this panel today.
Great. So my name is Kevin Leffew. I work at Microsoft within the United States public sector vertical. I work closely with the blockchain engineering team and with the decentralized identity team at Microsoft. I've been kind of contributing to the space, and I'm really excited for the concept of self-owned identity, where users own the keys to their own identity. And I'm happy to kind of dive deeper into that in just a little bit, but let everyone else introduce themselves.
Timothy Ruff. Is this on? All right, didn't sound like it. Timothy Ruff. I'm the CEO of Evernym and the co-inventor of the Sovereign Ledger, and a staunch believer of self-sovereign identity, and also a staunch believer that it's a bad term. It's a misnomer, and I bet you if we asked everybody in here, everyone would have a different definition for what that means. So we need to, I think, as an industry, figure out what the heck that means, because I think there's a lot of agreement that it's a good thing. But I think we need some specificity and clarity. Also, not only about what it is, but why it's better than anything else, how it compares to the way things are done today, and then how we'll get there. And so hoping we can explore some of that today.
And I'm Tim Brown. I'm with USAA, and I've got responsibility for advanced research out there at USAA. I got introduced, actually, to the sovereign concept, actually, through Timothy Ruff next to me. I am a board member on the Board of Trustees in the Sovereign, and I believe, just like David talked about this morning, that banks play a very critical role in protection and ownership and stewardship of identity for its members at USA and other customers. So here to talk about that aspect of it.
I'm Laura Jehl. I'm a partner at BakerHostetler in Washington, D.C. The firm is also founding steward of the Sovereign Foundation, and my practice is mostly in data security. I've had a role in cleaning up a number of the biggest data breaches that have occurred in history. And so that and my background before I joined the firm in emerging technologies, and particularly in internet, has caused me to spend a lot of time thinking about identity and anonymity and how there's got to be a better way than usernames and passwords. So that's what brings me here.
All right, great. Thanks, everyone. So Timothy, why don't we talk, you talk about self-sovereign identity being a little bit of a misnomer. So before we get too deep, why don't you define for the audience, what does self-sovereign identity mean to you, and what should it mean to us?
Well, first of all, in meat space where we all live, we actually don't have self-sovereign identity. Everything that's believable about you is something that someone else has said. In every context, whether you're trying to go through the airport, if you were to write on a piece of paper to say, my name is Timothy, it's not believable. You have to give them something that someone else said about you that's believable. So you can call yourself whatever you want, but frankly, it really does need to be something credible issued by someone else. And so self-sovereign identity, the way I define it, the way we define it as an organization, is the sovereign possession of digital credentials that can still be revoked by their issuers. Now, if I were to drive drunk and have my driver's license revoked, the DMV is not going to track me down and pull it out of my wallet. They'll put it into revoked status, but I still possess the artifact. And that's, I think, what we need to mirror in the digital realm. As I have a digital wallet, I have digital credentials. They were issued by other parties. I still possess those digital credentials, but when I present them, if they have been revoked by those issuers, then the relying party that receives those is able to see that and recognize that. So self-sovereign identity, if you were to sum it up, is the sovereign possession of digital credentials that can still be revoked by their issuers, and this mirrors real life.
Right, thanks. So Kevin, you used the word self-owned when you described it before. Are you thinking about it as a very similar definition, or what's your reaction to Timothy's definition?
Right, yeah, I think self-owned plays into self-sovereign. The idea behind self-owned is that users, in the end, own the private keys to their own identity. And so when we talk about identity within the wider context of who we are in the digital space, I think it's important that the users own that end key and that they can, as a first principle, own it, but then maybe give it to a custodian or have some kind of social recovery, NFM scheme. But I think as a first principle, it's important that users, have possession of that private key that links to their identity.
And when you say users have possession and own it, how do you envision that experience for the individual user?
Right, so we can think of traditional blockchain systems that exist today, right, or traditional public key infrastructure systems, and that would be kind of the foundation for how identity is rooted. So we can get into the architecture, kind of the split between identifiers and data stores, encrypted data stores, or we can kind of keep going down, what public key infrastructure is and what it means to have, private key, public key system.
Yeah. So, and I can already, it's interesting to look out at the audience and you can see people, their brains are already churning a little bit. I think, one of the topics we're here to talk about today is how real is self-sovereign identity? Is it coming tomorrow? Is it coming in 20 years? One of the, I think, criticisms or confusions, maybe, depending on your perspective, that we hear a lot is that the average consumer can't manage their keys. How is my elderly relative going to go to the store and transact in this world? So Tim, somebody coming in from a consumer-facing business a little bit, what's your feelings on that topic?
Well, I think it's an important topic because you can imagine, we already have services today that manage all your passwords and IDs and all the rest of that. Well, can you imagine the amount of keys that you're going to have in the future? And what do we do with? And they're valuable. They're going to be valuable to all of us to have these cryptographic keys that really attest to my identity. And then how do I hold that? Because every one of them may be a different type of relationship, a health relationship, a financial relationship, a social relationship. And so we need to have stewards to be able to help manage those on my behalf, because I don't want to have to intercede every time somebody's looking for a piece of information. I need to give a trusted entity, potentially a bank, the stewardship and provide them permission to be able to share that on my behalf. With the very same type of concept that we have around your financial. You give a bank to you give your money to the bank. You entrust them to not only manage it, but to invest it for you. Those are the same type of principles that we have around identity. So if you think about identity as being the new currency, banks have a huge protection role as well as a stewardship role on behalf of its customers and its members.
Okay, thanks.
Do you mind if I ask him a question?
Yeah, go.
Do you actually foresee banks protecting private keys for people, helping in the protection of private keys?
Why not? Yeah, I see. That's something that banks were set up to do, and USA is a little different because we have multiple lines of business. We're not just a bank. We're an insurance company. We do investment management. So we think of things a little bit differently. So it's not just about stewardship of those, Timothy, that I think. We also have protection and insurance for when that is breached. So if there's a certain type of a breach of identity, what can we do to help our members, to help customers be able to recover from that rapidly? And the damage that's done, what kind of protection can we offer them? Because assets in the future aren't going to be just your automobile, your home. We're sharing things more and more. It's going to be those digital assets. So we've got to provide protection as well as stewardship behind those assets in the future, and identity is foundation to all of those.
I think it's interesting that we've gone immediately to breachings of identity, where the whole idea, I think, was maybe this might get us a little moment of peace from the breaches of identity, but apparently not. I do think, when we think about ease of use, your elderly parents or grandparents or who is it, using this technology versus the sophistication of people who'd like to breach it or like to steal identities. I do think there is a tension that we're going to be struggling with. And it's interesting you suggest a role for banks, again, because the whole idea initially was to get away from centralized authorities, and yet they come back in a role to protect security. I think all this stuff has to get figured out, but there's still some tensions there.
Yeah, so it's just to kind of hear that. So that's another common, interesting debate point, right? The second an existing institution gets involved, there's fear of centralization. I mean, can somebody comment, is there room for centralized authorities to participate in a self-sovereign world without making it centralized again?
I think the most important thing is that as a first principle, users own those keys. And so if they choose to, say, give those keys to a custodian, that's their decision, and that's fine. But as a first principle, it should be theirs. It shouldn't be, central parties.
Yeah, I agree with Kevin. So from our perspective, it's still under the control of the consumer, the identity owner. So from my perspective, I would release control, right? I would give that to somebody else to be able to manage for me because it is a service as opposed to me having to manage it all the time whenever there's any kind of inquiry that is necessary for my identity. So I think it's important that we play a role, but the control still goes back to the individual. So from a self-sovereign standpoint, I see that is still foundational, right? Even though there may be stewards in the process, I don't see it as centralizing the authority.
So what do businesses need to do, though, to establish that trust? Because clearly I think there's been a lot of credibility lost with the public. And while it's good for us as experts to all say, no, it's a decentralized model and we play that role, how do we help get the consumers there?
Are you asking the question of adoption? How do we actually
Yeah.
get there?
Yep. Yeah, so adoption, because this is one of the barriers I think that we hear a lot. There's maybe a misconception, depending on how you look at it, or a fear that this isn't any better.
I think the answer lies actually in a much simpler place than most people realize. Most identity that we use is contextual. It's not cross-context. I mean, yes, our driver's license we use in a whole bunch of different places, but online, almost every digital credential we have only works in one place. That's why we have so many. And if you think about it, if USAA, for example, decided that they wanted to come out with a new identity technology just for USAA and their customers, they can. They could just make that decision, and by fiat, it's done. And if they wanted to start accepting, if they wanted to, for example, start issuing claims, digital credentials to their customers, and then accept those when they are presented back, my question is, how different is that from the way it works today when they give them a digital credential to log in, and it's used to log in? I mean, it stays within a single relationship, and it doesn't cross any other context horizontally. And so what you have an opportunity here with that understanding for a single organization to implement self-sovereign identity just between them and their customers. And there's this huge uplift for the organization. I mean, we think of self-sovereign identity because the term is self. And so we think of individuals, we think of people owning their own identity, and we kind of wrap ourselves in the flag. And we forget the huge advantage for the company. See, today they'll give a digital credential to their customer. And then that digital credential is supposed to be remembered and kept safe. Passwords are supposed to be kept safe and secret. And then they try to give them back. And we assume that if they give the same secret back, that it is who they claim to be. If you've got the password, if you know my mother's maiden name, if you know my birthday, then you must be who you claim to be. Well, it's nonsense. And what we can do with self-sovereign identity is we can actually say, without leaving the context of the company and the same customer, we can actually have the company issue a cryptographically assured claim, a verifiable claim, just like giving them a digital credential to log in, but now it's cryptographically assured by keys, right? And then when they come back, they present that back. It's better than a username and a password. It's better than the mother's maiden name and birthday. But the amazing thing here is we have not escaped the liability or risk, I don't know which relationship between bank and customer. We haven't tried to delegate to the third party. And frankly, that's the problem with federation. That's the problem with the whole IDP model, is that you're introducing a third party, and it just messes everything up because now you have risk and compliance issues. You can't delegate authentication to a third party. So if you can actually keep it between the organization and their customer and just increase the strength to cryptographically attested credentials, now you have a vector for adoption. Because now a single organization can start using this thing, and they don't need anyone else to play ball. And you can do it with institution after institution after institution.
Yeah. So this is what I hear from that is there's a familiarity there, and there's kind of we're not going to get from 0 to 100 overnight, but it's a slow improvement. Any other perspectives from the panel on that question?
Well, I guess, it's interesting because in that you can see the incentive for businesses to adopt the technology for that reason, but they have the disincentive, which is that if you're just sharing, you control your own data and you only share your own data for that purpose with them. They're not creating these huge stockpiles of data that they have now, which, present risk if they're breached, but also are hugely valuable and are monetized by every company, in the world these days, or at least until GDPR comes in. So I think there are incentives, both directions for businesses to adopt this.
Yeah, great. So since you bring up the stockpiles of data, I think that's definitely one of the benefits, the elimination of the honeypot of data that comes up a lot. I think some of the things that the naysayers may say is that some of the value you get from that information is somebody is able to produce a whole history about you, whether that's negative or positive. And I'd like to get some thoughts of the panel of, in a world where you control your identity and you only want to share what you want to share, how do we avoid this becoming the new resume where you're just putting your positive information forward? And how do we get to, some of the negative information that's important as we transact in this world?
Yeah, I think it's a huge point because part of the identity isn't just biologically who I am and I am me, but it's also reputation, it's relationship, it's all these entities that I have, whether it's a health relationship or a financial relationship or even a criminal type of perspective. There's going to have to be a way for third-party entities to get to certain personal information about an individual that they may not want to let go. But in protection and privacy and in security, we're going to need to have that capability. And I can't say that we've solved that yet. From my perspective, I don't think we've solved that. So even, for USAA, we would need to know that as well. Not only, just think about a simple background check for an employer. So how do you do a background check if Adam, you only control what I get to see? So we got to figure out how does that really work. So I think relationship and reputation and persona is going to be important, but it may not be fully controlled. It should not be fully controlled by the individual.
Any other thoughts from the panel on that?
Yeah, I think the lack of a provably positive attribute actually becomes very easily presentable. So a simple example, I can, maybe I don't want to share with you that I've had an accident in my driving record. But if I cannot produce a record of clean driving that I could get from the DMV, well, then that's going to raise a red flag. And so I think the beautiful thing about having a digital wallet is you can now carry all kinds of things that have it could be, I won the pull-up record in the 10th grade, or I got a merit badge in Scouts, or I ran a marathon in less than 3 hours, or it could be anything. And so I can carry all of these positive things about myself. And so now it could be the absence of something is the red flag.
Yeah. So let me play devil's advocate, because I've been you in this debate before. But what we hear back is, somebody that is trying to, let's just say, open fraudulent bank accounts for credit. If it turns out, okay, I need 3 good claims that I've done good business to do that, they'll get the minimum they need, do some fraudulent activity, then, re-up what they need for the minimum, and just always try to stay. So how do we build that model where the criminals are not just always staying one step ahead of what they need? Thoughts?
Yeah, I don't want to dominate, but it goes back to what I just said. I mean, if I can present 30 things, 300 things, in a digital wallet, I can carry around all of these things very easily. And so I can accumulate them. It's almost like a photo album that's of unlimited size, and it's snapshots of all the things I've accomplished or been awarded. And so it just becomes harder to falsify, especially if they come from a whole bunch of different places, and I can present almost an overwhelming amount of them. And people say in self-sovereign identity, actually there's nothing, at least in the system that we've designed, there's nothing preventing someone from creating a zillion different identities. The problem is, how do you make any one of them trustworthy? And if you can cryptographically assign to that identity, the DMV is only going to give one of those digital credentials to one of my identities. I can't go give a driver's license to every one of them. And so you can start to build up real things, and it's the positives and the absence of the negatives, I think, that makes it work.
But I think, I mean, that's the question, right? The absence of the negatives. If I did win the pull-up prize in 10th grade, which I did not, just for the record, if I have scout badges, which I also don't, but you have all this stuff and these great, credit history, but if I neglect to mention my criminal conviction, I only have one of those, but I just don't mention it. But I have an overwhelmingly great, clean record otherwise. And I think that's the problem, right? You can create all these great things, but if you neglect to include the ones that don't make you look quite so good, then how is it trustworthy?
I mean, in theory, right, couldn't you ask for an attestation, right, from an agency to show that you have a clean record? And then if they can't provide that, then, again, lack of...
Yeah, but I mean, I guess where does that end, right? So which agencies? If I'm convicted of, something bad in California, and I ask the authorities in D.C. if I have a clean record because I live here, they think I do. I mean, the question is sort of how many questions would you have to ask, and how much of it, again, going back to managing your own identity, to get to a point where it's reliable. Would I have to go and ask every state and carry in my digital wallet, a record from every state that I had was a good citizen? And how frequently would that have to be updated? All those, I think that all is the issues in terms of management that we're struggling with.
Does standardization or regulation help? I mean, I know we were working with a lot of different governments. So how are governments around the world building systems that they feel are safe and secure around self-sovereign identity, from what you guys have seen?
Are you Timothy or Tim?
Well,
Tim.
Timothy
I
or
don't
anybody.
work with
That was for
governments around the
everybody.
world since we're a
Yeah.
US.
It's probably
I
more
wouldn't be able to answer that one.
for Timothy and Kevin.
Yeah.
Probably more as tech providers.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, so, I think it's really important to work with agencies and help them build a strategy and really take a security-first perspective. Again, this is kind of a new space, and it's something that requires a lot of thought. And so it's not something where there's one clear answer, right, I think, as we've seen. And so it's really important that we design these systems in such a way that, you're providing protections for your constituent base, but also giving them, that level of assurance that they'd get on a physical piece of paper and kind of translating that to, some kind of digital token or attestation. So I think it's important to really, take time and work through this. And I'll let Tim, I think, might have more experience, Timothy, and might have more use cases that he can speak to.
Yeah, a couple of them. We're working with the IRS, for example, $6 billion in fraudulent returns every single year. State of Maryland contacted us, and the thing is people think that with self-sovereign identity that a government or an organization is actually sacrificing something to adopt it, that somehow they're giving away something. But if you actually talk to these people, the state of things is terrible. Their relationship with their constituents and the way that they get the returns and reliance on email and phone calls and everything, it's really, really bad right now. And so they're hungry. If you look at the technology adoption life cycle, usually government's just way far to the right, is like the last ones to adopt something. But we're getting cold contacted by governments, whether it's state governments or even entire countries, and it's crazy. And it's because the current system really, it stinks. I mean, Dave is sitting here, he said this morning, we're not having an impact. It's really broken. The bad guys are ahead. And I tweeted that out immediately, by the way. That was pretty ballsy that you would say that to the whole thing. You're having no impact, but it's absolutely correct. And these governments are feeling the pain right now as well. So not all of them are going to be early adopters. But the cool thing is there's a few. There's a few that will be early adopters that will lead out, and they will show they will show the rest of governments and the rest of organizations how it can be done. And specifically with self-sovereign identity, one thing that people do not realize, especially in the identity space, they think of identity really in terms of authentication, just making sure you know who it is. But with self-sovereign identity, you actually get to create a persistent connection with the individual. It's like a virtual VPN. It's encrypted end to end, and it's between you and them, and it's authenticated, and you can mutually share proofs back and forth, and it's a persistent out-of-band connection. And with that relationship, it's not email, it's not a phone call, it's encrypted, and you know who it is, and you can't be phished anymore because now you know it's the government when they're contacting you. Well, this new relationship simply blows out of the water the current broken relationship via email and phone calls that they have with their constituents. So, I mean, you can literally throw completely out all the benefits for the individual when you're talking to the governments and just say, be completely selfish, Mr. Government, and they have every reason to adopt this technology. So I'm very excited because if you can do that, if you can actually solve the risk model and give the incentive to the government a selfish benefit to adoption, they will be the ones driving self-sovereign identity, and we don't have to be touting the huge benefits for individuals, which are there as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great topic. In fact, the item that I retweeted this morning from David was talking about identity really being about the interactions we have with each other and with institutions at the edges, and you're hitting on that. A lot of I think head nodding across the panel there. Laura, what's your thoughts?
As to whether I think that it's right that the two-way nature of the relationship is important. That because even on the phishing issues and this current security, when you get an email from someone claiming to be your bank, you don't know that it's your bank. And so it's not just important that their bank know that you're you before transacting with your money, but you need to know that they're them. So I think that that's the piece of being adopted by institutions and governments and pushing it down is important.
Yeah. Tim, anything you want to add?
No, I think they're hitting on all the right spots. I think the only thing I would add is I had the opportunity last year to sit on a blockchain panel, and it was really cool. Financial services institutions talking about how we were going to change the world of financial services. And one of the panelists was from the University of Texas, and he was a professor. And he was using blockchain to give identity to refugees and those in small nations who did not have an identity. And so we felt small. I mean, I was talking about subrogation and PNC and all the rest of that, and he's saving lives. And I thought, see, that's the power of where identity comes in, and where a distributed ledger or self-sovereign type of construct are giving people who no longer had an identity with their own government a way to get services and to identify them versus others that are in a nearby government. And so you have people that literally have nothing finally getting services because they could be identified. Something simple like that is what really will change the world. So those are the countries that are going to be adopting this faster than Europe or United States or other places, because they have a real basic need. And guess what? They're starting from nothing.
Yeah, great. So Kevin, if we can maybe switch gears a little bit. So one of the other, I think, interesting observations and maybe challenges to establishing decentralized identity is that there's many different networks and different technologies that are forming at the same time, as many different groups are passionate about the problem. One of the groups that is trying to help bring everyone together around a common interoperability layer for identity in the internet is the Decentralized Identity Foundation. Could you talk a little bit about the role of DIF and the importance that it plays in helping us all try to realize our vision?
Yeah, sure thing. So the idea behind DIF is to create an interoperable schema for decentralized identity. What we want to avoid is these silos where you have, one data store with WhatsApp, one data store with Twitter, and they can't talk to each other and you can't transfer information. We want to create interoperable data stores, with one common schema. So the idea is that you root decentralized identity, you root that identifier on a blockchain, and you point that to an off-chain data store called an identity hub, where you store your attestations that are signed by third parties. So then you can move that end identifier, and that's malleable. So then if I want to, create another identifier and point that to that same data store, I can do that. The idea being that data store is owned by me, encrypted by me. It doesn't matter where it's stored. And so that's kind of the main idea there behind the Decentralized Identity Foundation. We're working with a number of different companies globally on making this a reality and making sure that we can really nail down the standards so that this system works and is also interoperable. And so I'm happy to go into more detail there.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. So there's the technology aspects, which I think are really great that you're talking about. I think one of the other interesting aspects is that there are multiple different models that some of these networks are doing around identity. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Should these things coexist? Do we need to try to get everybody onto one model? Maybe Timothy, what's your thoughts on this topic?
I think it's a great thing. I love the idea of experimentation. I'm a firm believer in fail fast and iterate. And we've made a huge amount of mistakes on the path to where we're at today. And there's a bunch of things we still have wrong. And I think that is going to be true of every organization. And so we have done the best we can so far at learning from other attempts. And seeing where the failures are, and then hurry up and experiment and fail ourselves and get through it. So I'm a firm believer in a whole bunch of different approaches, and then do a good job. Do a dispassionate, honest assessment of what works and what doesn't. And let's poll the best and let's publish it. We're believers in open source. We're going to be open sourcing a lot more than what we have. And so when you publish, you discover something. You discover something that works, a model that seems to solve a problem. Make it public, open source it, give it to the world, and off we go and go to the next level. And I think that we can really raise the tide for everybody that way.
Awesome. So one more round of questioning here, and then we'll open it up for some questions to the audience. So you can't have a topic or a conversation with blockchain without talking about tokenization. And I know maybe this will start with one of the folks that have been involved with Sovereign as well. You know, a token is a part of the identity model. Can you talk some about why that is and where do you see that fitting in? Maybe Timothy, that might be better for you. You want to start with that?
Yeah. So I think tokens are tokens are definitely the core of the blockchain attestation models. Tokens provide users a way to own some kind of data that's representative of some facts, some real world asset, some digital asset, and transfer that in a direct person to person way. And so we can imagine where this could be applied in all kinds of scenarios, right? 2 weeks ago, I was at Georgetown at the Digital Chamber of Commerce Hackathon, or Codeathon, and we put together a solution that used the ERC 721 smart contract token standard, which is a non-fungible token, to say, let's take a pharmacy tablet, take all of that data that would be on a pharmacy tablet, including signatures, including patient data, and put that in a token. So then the user can own that token, verify himself at the point of sale, and then create a system where forgery is near impossible. And so we think there's a lot of value there, and that's kind of one example of where tokens can provide value, right? Tokens can represent any kind of an asset, and they're transferable, and then they can be built on top of. So, does that answer the question, right?
Yeah. Cool. Any other thoughts from the panel? I'll jump in on the token topic. Everybody likes to run.
I'll mention something briefly on it. Tokens are, frankly, an amazing breakthrough. The fact that you can have a digital thing that can't be duplicated and copied and it can stay unique that's not going away. We're just going to see more and more creative implementations of that. And that will, to Tim's point earlier, just put more private keys in people's possessions. And to Kevin's point as well, is protection of those private keys. We're just going to see more and more cryptographic technologies generating more and more private keys for us to protect. And we're going to have to get smart at it. That's going to be the bugaboo of the whole movement is private key management, public key management as well. But when it comes back to tokens, you've got to have an exchange of value. I think one of the neatest things out there is micropayments. When I hit a paywall to an article that I want to read, I am perfectly willing right at that moment to pay a quarter, a nickel, a dime, a penny, whatever, to just get past the stupid paywall. And they don't need to know who I am, and I don't want to. And the problem is I hit the paywall and I leave. And I bet you everybody would win if I could pay them a nickel. The problem is you can't bill for a nickel. This is where tokens come in, because tokens, you can do instant settlement. You can do a micropayment with instant settlement. You can't split those two things. You don't want to bill and settle later for a nickel. So with the cryptographic token, to be able to have that instant exchange, it could be a tenth of a penny, it could be a penny, it could be whatever, some small amount, and it can really lubricate a whole lot of things that are really not very elegant right now in the way that we exchange value online.
I think it's a great point, Timothy, and think of it in terms of business. So you talk about micropayments, but even in the subrogation business and in property and casualty, whenever an insured is negotiating with another insured on a particular claim, we actually pay out a physical check for that claim, for every claim that's out there. So every accident you have, there's a physical check that goes back and forth, believe it or not. So think about tokenization, replacing all of that, and the friction that it will take out of the process just by a simple exchange of value that's already been netted out. Let's say at the end of the day, at the end of the hour, whatever time set you want to have, it's already been netted out. And that exchange happens. And the accounting is there, it's immutable, and it's forever.
Already been netted out, meaning no future settlement.
So
Just
no future settlement, and then also, let's say I have, let's say it's me and State Farm, and we have 100,000 claims that day. I net out 1 point payment, one token exchange. I don't have 100,000 checks going
cool.
back and forth, which is what
so
we're
cool.
doing today. So I mean, just simple business application is going to change. We can't really fathom exactly, with the efficiencies behind it, but just that one thing says, God, there's a whole lot of promise here. And just think about the premiums going down and the efficiency you're going to have. It's out there. It's just how do we harness that?
That's fascinating because it's like cash then. Because when I give
It's
you
exactly
when I give
like
you a
cash.
20, it's settled, it's done.
Yeah.
You've got it. I don't anymore. And
Yeah.
when you can do that with crypto, that's really cool.
And
The
you're
new
also doing
cryptocurrency.
it without sharing your identity. So you don't have to, and so that you're not giving that data, which would otherwise be monetized, presumably by whoever you gave it to. So you're giving them a micropayment instead. Right? You're paying them not to have your identity, not to have your information somewhere stored, and maybe not to be selling advertising against it. It's a model in which you actually pay with money as opposed to with data, but people are beginning to see the downside of paying with data. So that's another piece of it.
All right, let's open it up for questions. So just raise your hand, and lots of questions. Good. We'll just kind of start over here.
Yep. So my name's Ken. I'm with Microsoft. So I have a question on, Timothy, you said earlier that we want to drive elimination of third-party identity providers, right? I'm all for that model. But if we look at the crypto market today, we've noticed that it's moved away from the general initial thought of sort of the self-sovereign wallets, right? And it's moved towards this model of a broker. So you look at Coinbase, Binance, BitPi, these large brokers that have basically come up and essentially been the equivalent of IDPs for the crypto market. And just about every day, I'm seeing my phone buzz, and Coinbase has an ETH hack that has screwed over lots of people. Binance is down, right? How do we prevent those things from cropping back up? Third-party, rather than custodians, third-party identity providers that see the market, because I think consumers are going to latch onto those because it's a lot easier than maintaining a private key, right? They're going to latch onto those, and they're going to use them like IDPs in the traditional sense. So how do we prevent that from happening in the self-sovereign identity space?
Yeah, so the question, or you can just repeat it for the. We got to repeat for the video.
I heard you fine, though. He was talking about the dangers of the centralization of private keys in mostly in the crypto space, where organizations like Coinbase and Binance and some of these others, they act like a bank, and instead of the individuals getting their own private keys for their wallets, they're sitting in a big pile at that organization. Just frankly, and the answer to that, in my opinion, is that's a ticking time bomb. And so the only way we get out of that is, I hate to say it because it's a slippery slope, user experience. You said it in your question, and that is, it's so easy to have Coinbase do that. I watched my 23-year-old son, and I told him, I said, you should buy some crypto while you're young. I mean, he said, well, while nothing matters, right? It's like, get some crypto. Next thing I know, he's got some crypto, and he's showing me the app, and I'm like, where's your private keys? He's like, what? I was like, do you have a wallet with private keys? What are you talking about? No concept. His private key is sitting at Coinbase, but the user experience is like, look, I'm trading this and I'm buying this and everything. It's like ticking time bomb is what I see there. So the way to get away from that is we have to solve key management from a user experience standpoint. You know where we really need to go? Here's where we need to go. We need to go a place where grandma can manage 1,000 keys without anyone explaining to grandma what a key is, without her ever knowing. And if anyone ever tricks grandma and compromises something, that the damage is compartmentalized. They don't get everything. That would be stupid. And completely recover through friends and family. That's where we have to go. And that's a huge user experience dilemma and opportunity, frankly, to be solved.
It seems every time I do something really important, I have to sign my name on a piece of paper. And, it's if like the legal system, the handwritten signature kind of has a monopoly in the legal system. And I'm wondering if that's part of what keeps us from making headway as far as adoption goes.
Yes. So the question was, is handwritten signature a barrier to adoption?
I don't think so. I mean, I think even in the legal system, we're moving to digital signatures and verified signatures that are not handwritten. I think that ship sailed a couple years ago. This is a more sophisticated take on it, but at least I don't think the sort of original signature is what it used to be.
I think that's kind of the beauty of PKI, right? It's pretty easy to fake a signature, and in fact, I don't think people really check when you sign a receipt, right? You could sign as the Grinch or something; it wouldn't matter. It does matter, but it's more important that we move to a system that's verifiable. It's much harder to forge a signature if it's a digital signature, kind of built on PKI.
Yeah. And I'll break panelist moderator rule for a second, just to chime in on that. Timothy was talking earlier about kind of this evolution. So we still work with a lot of governments and financial institutions that for today's regulatory audit purposes, they need to record proof of signature, right or wrong. And I think what you're seeing is we're actually talking with some of the electronic signature companies about actually providing verifiable credentials, and they will go through the validation they do before, but then they'll give you something you can stick in your identity wallet to validate that. So there's stepping stones, I think, along the way. Next question.
Hannah Zupko, Intellect.eu. We're a blockchain integration company. My question is regarding data storage. Like for all the different projects, where data is stored and where do you envision it to be stored in secure and compliant way, especially in the light of upcoming GDPR and other regulations?
Where is data stored? And I think a question too in terms of GDPR.
Not on a public ledger. Ever.
But where?
In any kind of an off-chain data store, right? So that could be in a cloud provider, that could be on edge on a device, and probably the best way to do that would be to create redundant layers, right, of your hub, right? So in kind of the diff approach, the diff standard, you have an identity hub that has layers of redundancy, where you have your identity hub stored on device in multiple cloud providers, and it's all encrypted in the user side, so these cloud providers can't go in and crawl that data and sell it because you own the keys as a user. But it is important that it's off-chain. We think that the chain is really good for decentralized public key infrastructure. So you create an anchor on the blockchain, and then you point to something off-chain. And I think that is kind of the schema that we're looking at through the Decentralized Identity Foundation, right? If you own your identity hub, then you own it in the end. It's not on the chain. It's not public. We don't necessarily want it to be public. So hopefully that answers your question.
Questions all the way standing in the back. So you just have to stand the whole time.
Thanks, everybody. So my question is about hope, because I think ultimately blockchain is about hope. I'm the chief blockchain evangelist at LifeID. We're building an open source self-sovereign identity platform. And part of my job is to go out and find ecosystem partners, and part of my job is to educate the marketplace about identity and blockchain. And I think I found myself seduced to answer the question, what is blockchain, by defining it. And lately I've been thinking, what does it actually represent? For me, blockchain represents hope that my mom can send money back home without paying 6% in fees. Hope that my grandmother can live the last few years of her life owning her identity, doing whatever she wants with her health records, paying less for electricity. So, when you think about blockchain as hope, how do we inspire more developers of all the things that they could do with their skills to actually go into the identity space?
How do we inspire participation? Want to jump in?
I'll jump in. You can't spend hope. How do we inspire hope? Unfortunately, just like our speaker this morning, we live in a capitalist society. You have to provide incentive. Somehow you've got to either fix a problem, solve a pain, or provide an opportunity to make money. It's one or the other. It's a carrot or a stick. And until the organizations that actually have the control of the identity systems that we use today, which are government and enterprise, they're the ones who make the decision, top down, what we're going to use. We can't band together, no matter how much we love self-sovereign identity. We can't get 100 million of our favorite, cypherpunk anarchist friends together and march into some country or, business and say, this is what you have to do for us for our identity system. It's not going to happen. So what you have to do is you have to ride the elephant. You have to dance with the elephant, not fight the elephant. And you have to get them to a point where they understand it's in their own best interest to allow you to have a self-sovereign identity with your interactions with them. And until we can shift that argument to that point, then we're just going to be fighting the elephant instead of riding it. And I think the question about developers getting excited and coming into the space, it has to go right along with that. What's their incentive to do so? What problem are they solving, or how are they making money? And I'd love to be aspirational and think that hope would just, make it happen. But I think eventually you have to align incentives along either a carrot or a stick. And then you can really get the behavior that'll make the big difference.
Yeah, and I have a bit more of a practical view on that. So if I look at blockchain developers right now, we're in shortage of that, as you can imagine. I can't find really good ones, and we were dumb in the sense that we said, hey, I'm going to put a 5-year requirement for blockchain out there. Well, guess what? They've only been around for a couple of years, 2 years, and 3 years. So we made a huge mistake there. But here's what I'm seeing is. You put blockchain in front of anything and it sells. I mean, even my own business partners, they know they need to get on blockchain. They have no idea what it is, but they need to get on it, right? There's this fevered pitch that's going on with blockchain, but the developers will start moving there. I've already started to see it as they start to invest in their own careers. They're starting to get an understanding of distributed ledger. They got open source now through Hyperledger. There's a lot more opportunities. So you're going to start seeing this movement happen. And so from a blockchain perspective, it'll start to come. And we're paying top dollar for those folks. So there's your incentive, right, is we're paying top dollar for that expertise. The incentive.
Cryptocurrency or dollars?
Yeah, exactly. Well, the cryptocurrency side, that's a whole nother topic. But I would say to incentivize around identity, once you get them into distributed ledger, their identity is going to be foundation to almost everything we do. And so we're going to have to solve that problem within the chain, within blockchain community as a whole. And right now it's being solved many different ways. And to Timothy's early point, it's not necessarily a bad thing because we need to experiment, but from a business owner, we need to start consolidating around this pretty quickly. Because right now, I see it as a field of a bunch of people getting on a soccer field, kicking around a bunch of balls, trying their own experiments, and we have no idea where the goal is. And they're not even forming as teams, which actually blockchain is a team sport, identity is a team sport. So we're not even there yet. So we're still immature in our organization. Eventually, the defragmentation will happen. I'm hoping that that's going to happen within the next 18 months. But given I love your word hope. There's a lot of hope, but practicality is we've got to start moving the ball down the field, so to speak, and understand where the goal is, not just for identity, but for blockchain and distributed ledger in general.
And I think we have time for one last question.
Can I hop in at the end of that? Just to add one quick thing to that, I think there's both incentives and hope, right? So I think there's a really strong incentive for user adoption, for users to own their own data. It creates new opportunities for monetization for companies and for networks. And from a hope perspective, there's an incentive for individuals to get out of these data silos, to avoid these scenarios that we've seen with other major companies, losing control of user data, losing control of PII. And I think that provides a lot of hope for developers and also economic incentives for networks and for companies to get into this space.
All right. Last question, there in the back.
My name is Kevin Renano, a Forbes contributor. We want to have a system like a sovereign identity system where the absence of information in a particular domain is of interest to the corporate client. There are a whole lot of domains, and a lot of those domains have time-sensitive information, like the DMV example that you brought up before. that seems to put an awful lot of responsibility on the user, the person whose identity we're talking about, to keep all that data up to date constantly. How do you solve the problem of motivating, getting people to do this when we've got a public that has been using one password for everything for 5 years?
Yeah. So,
You can see the possibility for third-party entities to jump in and manage all this for you and keep it up to date for you, but that seems to just counter the whole idea of controlling your identity through a sovereign identity model.
so how do you motivate people to manage and keep things up to date, and even twist that is the things we're doing that can even help with that? So,
Yeah, I can just speak to the way that we've architected our technology, and that is you can't have an identity system that does not have the ability for revocation. You got to have it. And so the way I think that people assume with blockchain, because you hear about the immutable characteristics, and if you think that identity is solved by just sticking a piece of identity data on an immutable blockchain and then just pulling it down over and over again, that's stupid. I'm sorry, that is not good architecture. It doesn't solve really any problems at all, frankly. But yet we see this over and over and over again. And so we've done something very different. The only thing that goes on the ledger are public keys and public identifiers, no data. People keep their own data. But we also have a revocation capability that would enable, for example, a driver's license division to update something called a cryptographic accumulator and a tails list, but it's stuff that kind of works offline and with the ledger in conjunction, so that when you present your driver's license, that the relying party receiving that cryptographic claim can, at that moment, tell if it's current or not. And it's up to the driver's license division as to how often they update the cryptographic accumulator. And it could be up to every minute, every 5 minutes, or whatever. But literally, when you go to rent a car, they'd be able to see, which they can't today, if your driver's license has been revoked up to the last 5 minutes, if the DMV wanted to update it that often. And the wonderful thing about that is the individual no longer has the burden, because I agree with you, it's just not realistic that individuals are going to go update that stuff. It's never going to happen. They just need to carry around one digital thing, and when they present it, the relying party needs to know if it's current or not.
all right.
And that is possible now.
All right. So with that, unfortunately, we are out of time. I know we couldn't get to all questions, but thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you to my panelists, and enjoy the rest of the conference.